So, welcome to today's podcast. Thanks for joining me as always. And if you're listening, you probably know that one of the themes that we talk about here a lot at Perennial Pride is that true wealth goes beyond just money and financial assets. It's about family, purpose, stewardship, and even legacy. And I'm really excited because today's guest is building an entire business around this, around helping families preserve those things in addition to wealth, right? And so Heidi Olson is the founder of Pathfinder Legacy. Love that name. She works with families, business owners to help them navigate estate planning, business succession, and family legacy conversations, which can be tricky. And we're going to hear a lot more from her about it. But really what stood out to me, and we talked a little bit about this before we even started recording, is around even the family and the family stories that are generated, preserved. That's part of legacy, which maybe naturally for some people that doesn't naturally equate to that. So love to hear more from her for today. So Heidi, I'm excited to have you join me today, talk a little bit more about, the work that you do and how you're helping families and farmers across the country get to the heart of what wealth really means. So Heidi, welcome.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom. I'm so excited to be here and visit with you and have all your listeners listening in to kind of get a feel for some of the things that I work on and do, and in a nutshell, what I do to help clients.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Before we get kind of going with some of this stuff, so kind of how would you, because I explained it in my terms, but how would you explain what it is you do and how do you help families?
What I do is really Pathfinder Legacy. It is helping farmers, ranchers, and doesn't have to just be farmers and ranchers because, right, they are business owners, they are entrepreneurs, but also helping those family members that have businesses, and then even just working with families. You don't have to have a business to work with me, but helping them find the path, preserving their legacy, Pathfinder Legacy, that path to their legacy and preserving it, and what their legacy really means to them. So, it's at the end of the day, it's not just assets, what we own, our house, our cars, our collectibles that we have, but it's what the family heritage is that we're really passing on to the next generation and preserving and making sure that they knew who our ancestors were and who really how did this family tree get built? So, helping families with estate planning, navigate those conversations, but also navigating the conversations of who they are, what their history is.
Very fascinating. So it kind of touches on it because, legacy can be very, to your point, focused on like a number or wealth. And obviously yours goes much broader, your definition of what really legacy means. And I don't remember who sort of stated it, but it kind of sort of reminded me of it was someone asked someone, what's your legacy around business? And they said, it's not about that. It's the character of my children. That was his legacy. And that struck me because then you can redefine what it means. But I guess my first question for you around this, because maybe this is a trickier topic because, obviously money is a topic that I think is sometimes a taboo topic. Why do you think families maybe avoid this conversation, right, to some degree?
I think it goes back to generations back. I remember with my parents, tell this quick story about my husband and I. We were going on a trip. First trip, we were going to be gone for more than 2 days. And we had a young child at the time. She might have been 3 years old. We just started our family business, my husband and I farming, and building our own assets. So here we had assets that you couldn't specifically tie beneficiaries to make sure that everything is titled properly. But so in the state of North Dakota, they allow holographic wills. So you could write a will on a blank sheet of paper and just have a witness, and that should hold up in court unless someone really wants to testify it or contest it. So going on this trip, we wrote up our wills. And I remember putting it in the diaper bag and telling my mom and saying, hey, this is if something happens to us, we're in an accident or whatever, this is what our wishes are. And she got mad at me. And she said, Heidi, stop talking like that. What are you saying? You guys aren't dying. I'm like, no, I don't plan on dying because none of us have a crystal ball though. But she just couldn't fathom that. And I just talked so openly about it because of my work history, and it didn't bother me because that's just what you do. So I think that to answer that question, it goes back to we never talked about it. That was
Mm.
always something that was, you believe that in the shadows. You leave that in the shadows, you close the closet, and you don't talk about it. Because if you talk about it, you're talking about your own mortality. And nobody ever wants to talk about that. Because if I do something today, I'm going to pass away tomorrow. And if I just forget about it, I don't have to even I don't have to have it on the top of my mind to think about it. So I think it just goes back to past generations never wanting to talk about it. And you think about even on like the TV shows that we would watch, did they ever talk about it? They didn't talk about it. You didn't hear about any of it. I think about like Dallas or something. Everyone's sitting around the boardroom table and listening to the attorney read the will. That's when they would find out what really mom and dad's wishes were or what the wishes were for the business because they didn't talk about it until after they were gone. And that's one thing I want to change. So why are we waiting like that? Why are we scared to do that? Don't we, I think it's important to our be able to share these things with our family members. Now, I'm not saying to open up the checkbook and tell your grandchildren this is exactly what our balance is in the checkbook. I'm talking about hey, this is what we're preserving for you. This is what we've worked so hard for to build for our family. And this is what it stands for. And this is what we want to pass on while we're still here. You've got the values, the stories, work ethic, be your whole family identity.
And that's why I think for a lot of this stuff, it's nobody wants to talk about their day they leave this earth. Like some people call it graduating, right? You can graduate to something else, right? And it's almost like if you talk about it now, you're going to will it to have, which I've heard people tell me that, and I said, well, maybe I don't know. I mean, I know I don't have absolute control over it, but I guess it just takes a little different mindset to recognize that's just a reality of life, and you might as well talk about these things so you can have a productive transfer, right, at some point and preserve like the things like you said are important, not just the money. So, broadly speaking, I mean, having a lot of these conversations with different types of families, like when they're finally able to start talking about it, like what have you learned through these conversations that might be interesting for those who are thinking about it for their own families?
When I can finally get them to talk about it and feel just, relaxed and that they know that they're in a safe place, they can have that discussion and no judgment, no, this is what we have and what we want and no second guessing that,
Mm.
why are you doing it that way? This is what we have planned. So having that conversation. So first getting them to open up. It is the first step, talking about it and knowing that you're not dying tomorrow if you do have this conversation, but knowing, and during your lifetime, don't you want to see that you can give to your children or your family or see the good of what you've worked for? If you so choose that you want to see the benefits and the joy and what difference you can make.
Mm.
I mean, why are we working so hard for these things if we just keep it all inside and we can never enjoy and have that joy of being able to carry on and see what we can do. So, sitting down at the table, first off, having that conversation, what really that person's wishes are, yes, you have financial assets and going through the checklist of everything and making sure that there is an end game for every single piece of property that they own or every bank account, but also all the other things that we want to wrap our hands around, whether it's the family stories, it's, how the family had to persevere to get where they're
Mm.
at. It's the great grandparents who homesteaded, who came through Ellis Island here. Who were there any name changes? I know that there were name changes in my husband's family. Originally, it wasn't Olson. It was Helgeson. So strangely, then they dropped some of the letters and rearranged it and just said, well, there's too many Helgesons. So they went to Olson. So, how would anybody ever know that type of history if they never passed it down from generation to generation and talk about it? So Yeah, it's a lifetime of lifetime of meaning of that spend from generation to generation.
Yeah, because even so, I had conversations with my mom about things and learning about my grandparents I didn't really know because they passed when I was super very young. But it was, fascinating to learn about their history, and they were entrepreneurs. And, here I came from a life with not being an entrepreneur until more recently. And it was just fun to learn about it because obviously these people, had obviously their genes and connection to them, but it's inspiring to see because I didn't really get to meet them. But, this is a way you get to know them and understand where I came from, even though they were born and raised and live lives in different countries, right? They're still connected to me and who I am. And so it's just fascinating to sort of learn about it. And it inspires you kind of to say, okay, what else did I not know about my family history? Right. And how do we continue to allow our children to learn about it? Right. And pass it
Right.
along so it doesn't die. Because,
Right.
you know, and that's the thing. When you think about it, like, yeah, we're all going to leave this earth. And, in a positive way, it helps me sort of not worry about every little thing right? That may have caused me to worry before, but what causes families to kind of lose this legacy? Is it because they don't talk about it? Is it other things? Like from your lens, from you like, how does these legacies get lost? Is it just
Yeah.
ignored?
Yeah. Well, and oftentimes you're right. They ignore it because they don't even, they have anxiety towards it, even thinking about the conversation because they don't want to have any conflict. They don't want you may have those family members that are included in the business that, doesn't matter what type of business, they might be coming back and starting to get their feet wet and getting going in the business. But then you may have those family members that are somewhere else that have created their life and created their
Mhm.
careers. So they don't know how to treat those family members because you have one in the business and one outside of the business. Well, they always think fair has to be equal. So, which that's not always my philosophy, depending on there are other things that can be done to compensate if that's their wishes. But oftentimes they avoid it because they don't want conflict. They
Mm.
don't want to have, that silence that creates between family members, the deadline at the end of the phone call because someone didn't get what they thought they should get or they're upset that someone is getting something more than them. But everyone makes choices in life. So it's all about you choose to make your life and your career with your family elsewhere and you didn't come back to the family business and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that if you keep yeah, I might get into that part of the conversation a little bit so I don't get too sidetracked because there are so many things, but I really think the conflict is the biggest thing. And adult children have different expectations on what they feel should happen. And sometimes you need to squash those fears or expectations by I just say just ripping the band-aid off and just sitting
Yeah.
down at the table and having the conversation and starting small. Oftentimes people think that when they first start with these conversations, they have to have it all figured out right now. And it's a lot of thought process
Yeah.
that they need to put into this. So if it's just starting with even just building a timeline that mom and dad, how long do you think you want to stay in the business? Well, right now we want to stay in the business another 5 to 10 years. Okay, great. So that gives us a starting point so we know, but then we can start building things and putting the rest of the timeline together and figuring out what is needed. So I'm not sitting here just in limbo wondering what I should be doing because all too often you hang off on the wings, your successors or your family members, and that's where the anger and frustration comes from because, well, they never told us. And here we waited our whole lives over here, waiting for mom and dad to tell us when, and they never did. And now mom and dad are 90 years old. And now I'm in my 50s and I have to make a decision. Those are hard things to have to work through. But why wait?
Yeah. Yeah. Because it struck me because there was one conversation I had with somebody, and I think I mentioned it to you before on a different conversation where the father had passed, the mom was close, like she was ill, and it was expected she would pass sooner and later. And the daughter and their family had absolutely no idea what would happen when she passed. Right? There had been no conversation. They were seen to, and the mother wouldn't talk about it. Right? It was going to be a massive surprise, good, bad, or indifferent. And, it was just, again, back to the lack of communication, sharing, and planning around it. But that was probably just the way things were done. Right? And it's just that topic wasn't discussed in that manner, but it left them completely sort of in the dark. And, yes, it was hyper focused on the money part of it, but, the other aspects of it were not even on the table to discuss because there was none happening.
Right.
So
Right.
I just listened to that. And it was just amazing to hear. And I wonder how often that happens.
It happens so many times that family members, and I'd tell you this story. And again, it's not just, it doesn't matter what type of business it is, whether it's a farm or ranch operation or the hardware store in town. It's all business. So I had a gentleman that passed away, and he was never married.
Mm.
And, no children. He was engaged once, but that didn't ever materialize. And he had a sizable estate. And he had a farm and a ranch. And he had oil income because here in the northwest part of the state, that's where the Bakken is. So you hear all the oil and gas production. We've got a lot of that here. So he had mineral rights. And he had family members that kept asking him, and they were nieces and nephews. He had one sibling. Nieces and nephews kept asking, what are you going to do with your farm someday? Are we going to have the farm? They kept harassing him. And he was the type that if you pushed him, and he didn't have anybody to help guide him at the time, to help talk him through this, he's, yep, I'll give it all to you when I'm gone. Well, he passes away. And we find out that it wasn't what they thought they were going to have, because they were looking at it the wrong way. They were looking at it to help grow themselves and help for their own initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
So he gave it all to a foundation and put it in a charitable foundation, and they didn't get anything but maybe some personal vehicles and maybe some guns or something, some collectible items. So they were very angry. They were upset why they didn't get anything. But if they maybe would have had more guidance and sat down and had the conversations, it could have been different. He maybe would have considered giving them a portion of his assets, maybe a piece of property over here, or maybe some of his mineral interests. But he looked at it as the way they approached him, they were just digging, the term gold diggers, and they just kept digging for things. So they didn't know. So when you talk about having a business or having assets ownership, and then you pass away and no one knowing, well, this was a case where he purposely didn't want them to know, because he didn't want to be harassed anymore during his lifetime, and he didn't know how to handle it. So that was a huge blow for the family, and a lot of anger, and they wanted to, contest things. And he did all the right things to protect himself and have it all drawn up with, it was all papered up. So he was protected. His estate was protected. But, after he passed, they gave, the personal vehicles that he did give them, they sold them. They didn't keep those vehicles. Nothing was a collectible item, but they didn't keep those items. They sold them and turned them into cash. And, maybe it wasn't a vehicle they wanted, but it wasn't anything that they weren't looking at it for the fact that, hey, our uncle is giving us a vehicle that we can use to drive. It was, what more can we obtain here?
Yeah. And that's a shame. And then you hear stories like that, and that's probably not what he would have won in the end. But I guess given a lack of sort of coordination around that, I guess that was just his approach to do what he thought was right, I guess. Right. And I guess when you deal with families who are doing it, I guess, quote unquote, right, right? And successfully transitioning in, I know you named a few things like what are the main things that they're doing to help? Obviously, better communication planning, but what else are they doing to really help this? Because it can feel very daunting and a big task, but how are they managing it? Like, how are you helping them see through it?
To see, okay. So first, sit down with, so you don't have a whole room full of folks that all have, everyone's got an opinion, but then it's hard to come up with answers. So first, it may be sitting down with mom and dad, sitting down with the owners, sitting down with them first in a, safe place where they know that they can share, it's confidential. They can share what their concerns are, what their thoughts are. Do they have any children that might have addiction issues? Do they have any children that maybe their relationship might not be a solid relationship, that they have to make sure that something doesn't happen in either bankruptcy or divorce or other concerns, addictions? So really having that safe conversation first, just them, and then bringing in just the players that need to be brought in. So, I've got several clients that I've worked with where I'm just visiting with mom and dad first, find out what they want. And then there might be whoever the successor is, sitting down with that successor, who's going to the next person coming into the business, and sitting down with them separately. Because how many times will they have a conversation in front of mom and dad? And many times there's blow-ups and anger. And that's not what I wanted. That's not what I was thinking. And they're not even listening because they're so focused on that's what they are saying right now we should or shouldn't be doing. So now they're not even going to give us any sort of control, whether it's on mom and dad's side or the children's side. And typically I don't have spouses in there because so many times, and spouses aren't meant to be left out, but in my years of working in the trust department and working with trusts and estates, spouses were not included because, if they're married to someone that is on that family tree branch, more than likely they're going to reap the benefits of something. Now, when that child passes away, their widow is probably not going to get anything anymore unless mom and dad decided they wanted to give them something, but they want to keep things in the family tree and not always branch it out because that person gets remarried. Then next thing you know, things get diluted more and more for someone else's family and not what their intended family tree is. So so just a side note, that's typically why spouses aren't always included. But then if there is a spouse of one of the business operators, soon to be have ownership interest, then we are bringing that spouse in because they are a partner. They are a partner that needs to be included in, and they do have a voice. But the initial conversation is just figuring it all out, getting all the nuts and bolts out on the table, figuring out what everyone's intention is, what they want, figuring out what that successor, the child coming into the business, what they want, and being able to have open conversations. Then I bring them together, figuring out, I'm kind of like a mediator. So think of a family mediator and bringing them all together and helping them structure that conversation, that this is what, or how about we do it like this, or how about like that. Even with spouses, I've had a situation where I was working with a client and one of the spouses left the room to use the restroom or something. And the other spouse said to me, "See, they won't let me talk." And they were, close to retirement age. And see, they won't let me talk. They won't let me put in what I want. And sometimes when you're dealing with spouses, you might have one that talks more than the other. And you might have one that, hey, they talked about it beforehand and they're the spokesperson for the relationship. Somebody might be quieter. But hearing that, it's like, okay. Thank you for sharing that. When that person comes back into the room, now I know how to structure the conversation and how I can ask you directly, okay, now tell me what your wishes are. Do you agree with what is being said. So when I talk about that mediation, that's some of the other things that you work on to structure and make sure you read the room and know, do they all have a voice? Are they all getting a voice in what they want? But really just breaking it down. Once you break down what they want and what direction they want to go, okay, now how do we get there? How do we create that roadmap to get to the end results that you want? And sometimes that roadmap might have detours along the way. There might be other things that we have to do to get through that, or it might be a long detour to get to that, because they might not have thought of some of the other implications that we have to be considered, whether it might be getting the attorney involved and getting that legal advice. But it's like, okay, we can do it like this, but we better just double check on making sure that you can do that in your state or your domicile. But tax law changes. And there were a lot of changes this last year with the one big, beautiful bill. So what other tax advantages can we take into consideration? Making sure that when we're transferring and doing some of these succession planning items, that you're not creating more tax hiccups for yourself and a bigger tax bill. So looking at all those pieces, and then, all right, do we need to research? Do we need to reconvene later? Let's bring your other advisors into the table. So I'm really that person that wraps my arms around all of the advisors that should be at the table to help, and making sure everything keeps flowing through. Because oftentimes you're working and something might get hung up over here with the attorney or with the accountant. Well, who's pressing to make sure it keeps moving forward if there's not that mediator person to help them? Oftentimes it's hard for clients to know. I mean, you and I've worked with all types of advisors. So that it doesn't seem intimidating to us to be working with advisors. But when you're working with families, they know their business and they're really good at running their business or running, with working with their family. But they're not always comfortable knowing what questions to ask or what it means, how to interpret that without having, you like, I don't want to ask because that might seem like a dumb question. Well, I always say no question is a dumb question, because if you don't ask, how are you going to know and how are you going to learn? But they're not afraid. They're afraid to ask those questions because, number one, they don't want to sound incompetent. And they, number two, may not have the experience to even know what to ask. So that's where.
Because that's what, too, is a sequence to it, and to some degree, like the way you walk through. Because to your point, it can be complicated, and it's something maybe they haven't really spoken much about. So it can be probably difficult to sort of open up and really, and sometimes people are probably, you tell me if I'm wrong about it, sometimes don't know what they truly would want until they start really thinking about it and talking through with somebody and exploring it to some degree. And then, when appropriate, bringing in the other family members, right, to kind of continue the dialogue. But some people really haven't, like, you probably thought as deeply about it yet until you kind of can have these more formal conversations, right? They may have an idea, but that's where I guess, your role can really play a big role, is to help them sort of explore and think through it, and without any sort of judgment around it. It's just trying to let them open up, and then doing the same for the relevant family members who might be kind of part of the succession planning, right? It's kind of easing into it, because these are potentially touchy situations, especially if they're not in sync, right? Or thinking the same way, how you bridge it. Right. That's probably the magic of it.
And that's oftentimes, you hit the nail on the head, because there's oftentimes, they don't know what they don't know and what options are out there. As you could go sit down with your attorney and they can say, well, tell me what you want. You have XYZ assets. You've got these investments. You've got this investment property, real estate, etc. But you've got 3 family members over here. One wants to be in the business and 2 don't. What do you want? I don't know what I want. I don't know. What are my options? Well, here's the box. Just fill in all this stuff and then we'll talk about it. But You really have to sit down to get to know the family and
Right.
figure out the dynamics and how they operate, how they work together, how everything meshes to know what they want. If you don't know them and it's just a quick hour conversation and okay, well, here's my ideas. This is going to fill in the blanks and we'll have this nice template document over here for you at the end of the day. It doesn't work that way. You're really looking at the whole picture and looking at the financials. Maybe it's looking at some P&Ls or balance sheets and asking them the questions and the leading questions. And sometimes I might want to ask them the same question 3 different times in our conversation, but I'm
Mm.
asking it differently to see if their answers are still the same or getting them to think about something else. It's like, oh, yeah, well, we could do it like this. Because, in my former life, and I didn't talk about as much as this yet, but, I have 30 years of banking experience and 22 years of that, I worked in a trust department doing wealth management and trust and estate planning and, you know, administering trusts and estates. So when you're sitting across the table, you can really see what worked in those documents and what doesn't work. And working with different families and trying to figure out the dynamics and well, maybe there's something extra that you could do over here for this child or to protect your assets because somebody might have a spending issue or somebody has other types of, dynamics that you just want to make sure that they're taken care of, but also you're protecting what you've worked so hard to build. So really digging into knowing the family, learning who they are, and getting them to open up and to talk and to know that what plan you do today, sometimes they're cemented in. If you do something like an irrevocable trust, although they can be changed in certain states because you can just petition the court, and as long as the beneficiaries all agree, and sign off on it, yep, you can change those. It's not as easy, but other cases, you need to be, if you're doing something for an estate plan or whatever your succession plan is, know that sometimes it's fluid and it changes because there might be life events that happen that you don't always think about. We're not the same person we were 10 years ago. You might have family members that have been born into the family. There might be deaths. There might be marriages. There might be additional businesses that have been acquired. All of those things need to be considered because now this changes the picture. And it's got to be ever changing. And I'll tell clients that you need to look at it. If you haven't had any life event change, nothing going on, everything stayed pretty much the same from what it was 5 years ago. Okay. Well, just look at it just to make sure that you don't have anything else that maybe you haven't thought of. Otherwise, if you have had a change, you need to be looking at your plan more frequently than every 5 years.
Yeah, and that's why we've always harped on the idea of, there's so many different facets of your financial life and your wealth, and it touches on so many different areas. That's why, having some consistent rhythm to review it and adjust it and pivot, because things will change, right? Priorities change. And, and that just kind of happens with life. But if you're kind of not only looking at it very infrequently, it's probably outdated, right? And doesn't apply to kind of what your current thinking is or desires. And that's why I know it's difficult for a lot of folks. Some people I know that they know they've had it on their sticky note on their board or something. I need to get my estate plan going. That's been sitting there for years, right? And they still can't get the first step. So, part of me thinks like for a lot of these things, because it's a journey, like for people who are interested in business owners or not even non-business owners who want to, hey, I care about my legacy. What can they even do this week to get started, right? To start thinking about this.
To start thinking about it, I think the biggest thing is getting a list put together of what all they have. Whether it's looking at your tax return. Sometimes there's depreciation schedules in your tax return. It could be looking at that. It could be looking at, you have a tax folder that you put everything together and you saw all those 1099 interest and dividend statements that came in. All right. Okay. So now we know what exactly we have. If we don't have a balance sheet, building that, and then figuring out what our timeline is. How soon, if we have a business, we don't have a business, well, then, you still need to get something taken care of before you're traveling and retiring and so forth. But if you have a business, what really is my timeline? So number one, putting together your list of assets, getting that under, putting together a list of all the family members. Because if you don't have that list of family members who's in there and if something happens, okay, where's their contact information? How do we reach these people? And then getting online built. And when they're wanting to retire, when they're wanting to start working on it. And just because you build that timeline doesn't mean that it's set in stone, that you have to abide by that, because it's the same thing with life events. They change and adjust. But, one thing else I will tell clients when they are putting their inventory of assets together for me, one of the things I want to see is, how is it titled? How are those assets titled? Are there some that are just in your name, or are they held jointly with your spouse? And if it is something that can have a beneficiary, whether it's a retirement account, 401k, IRA, 403b, and any of those types of retirement accounts, do you have beneficiaries listed? Same thing, life insurance. If you have beneficiaries listed, we need to review those and make sure that they are who they say they are. Because sometimes if you don't have anything listed, it's going to go to your estate. And that opens up a whole nother can of worms for being able to do any of your elections that you wanted in tax purposes. And it might tie up things longer than what you're expecting if you could just have had an updated beneficiary listed on there. So really figuring out what their goals are at the end of the day and seeing what, if there's a surviving spouse, where is the money going to come from to take care of them immediately if something happens? Because they're grieving you, your family's grieving you, they're all grieving. And then that's where the heads start butting, because somebody is under stress and they're grieving and they can't find the paperwork. Now what do we do? Well, we just fight and we just start arguing about things. And next thing you know, we're all mad at each other and you end up going down the road that you never thought you would be going down.
Yeah, and it's easy to say when, for me, at least as I'm just thinking objectively about it, is, yeah, obviously you want to plan, and so you can think about it now. You don't want to be in the position on the other end of it, not have planned for it, not have to figure things out on the fly and react to it. And unfortunately, in a lot of situations, that may be resulting in, to your point, conflict within the family, or maybe having to liquidate assets you didn't want to liquidate, right? All these unintended consequences that could have maybe been addressed if you were kind of talking about it beforehand and getting things in place. It's a huge and heavy cost at the end, probably. And that's what a lot of people say. They don't have the time or money to do these things. But unfortunately, I think if those things hit, they could be hugely time-consuming, expensive on the other end for families, not even just on a dollar perspective, but the burden it causes folks, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of taking that into account. So when would you want to solve this? Before it happens or after?
Right. Yeah.
Right. Which is,
yeah, you're absolutely right.
And it can be done.
Do you want to be proactive and have a plan ahead of time and have those hard conversations now, or after you're gone? It's going to be a lot harder for your family. If you think it's difficult now that you want to avoid it, then I don't think you want to know what's going to happen after. And I've had clients and I've been at speaking engagements where family, mom and dad, the children aren't there, but mom and dad are in their 80s and I'll say something and mom is really leaning in and she's like, oh, the good ideas. I want to learn more. And dad is sitting in the background and he just gets really quiet and almost just he slowly inches away from me. And he's like, and then he says, they'll figure it out. I'll just let them figure it out. And I said, well, yeah, that is a plan. You can do that. But I don't think that's going to be a good plan to just let them figure it out. it can very well turn into a lot of conflict and frustrations and waste a lot of your estate, where some people, they don't realize that if we ever had to go to court and contest something, who is paying for the attorney fees? Yes, if I had to hire an attorney to contest, to go against what my parents' will was, but where's the money going to come from to defend my parents' side? It's going to come from the estate. It's going to come from their assets. So you're depleting your own assets, and people don't always think of that.
Right.
But
Yeah.
yeah,
But outside the money part of it, I guess this is for those who are listening. It's, one is planning ahead of it, and there's a financial implication cost wise, right? I think you can pay now or pay later, right? Depending on the positioning of it, but also, down to sort of family and the love you have and care for them. This is putting the care package in place
yeah,
for the unfortunate case when something could happen, and your family's taking care of that. That's what personally for me it sort of motivates me to do stuff like that, because it's like, okay, in the worst case scenario, then they can grieve, they can move on, and they know that I cared enough to do something for them so that they didn't have to suffer as much and pay. I mean, that's just a personal thing, and I'm not saying that people have to have that thinking, but that's another arm to it that is outside of just the dollars and cents of it all.
right.
So, we covered quite a lot, different topics around legacy and which I do love the story element to it, and preserving the family stories and having, facilitating the conversations so families can really, and hopefully that builds strength within the family to have these conversations. I hope, I believe that's the case. So, Heidi, what's the one thing that, through the course of all of these things that we've talked about, that you'd want the listeners really to take away? Like, if there was one thing out of this, what would you want them to sort of kind of take away and think about, even for their own families or businesses and their legacies?
Talk. You need to communicate. Talk with your family. All too often, families stop talking. They don't talk at all. Sometimes their ears are open, but their mouth is open wider, because they're not listening. The ones that need to be listening, they have something to say and they want to talk. But you need to be able to listen to what your parents want, what the current owners want. So it's, I guess at the end of the day, it's the communication piece that is the biggest piece. And if you don't communicate, you don't have a plan. If you can't communicate, whether it's communicating with your advisors what you want, and then being able to communicate with your family on what you're transferring to them, what you're succeeding to them, that communication piece is big. And I guess that's, the hardest part, because they don't talk. And I see family members, it's different family members, differently how they were raised. Some families talk a lot, maybe too much. And some families don't talk at all, because that's not how they were raised. They just didn't talk about it. So communication is my biggest takeaway. And don't wait to start. I mean, you can't change what's happened in the past, but one more day that you've waited, you're losing time. You really need to make a plan and just start one foot in front of the other today and start putting your list together.
No, that's wonderful. And it's a simple step, I think, for everyone you could take, even if it's talking to your spouse, to kind of get things started. And just like anything, I think it becomes easier to talk about the more you talk about it. Just like anything in life, like riding a bike, it may be difficult to get started, but once you do, I think, these conversations hopefully will become easier and more fruitful. And I personally have experienced this myself, because it was an uncomfortable topic for us and never talked about it before. But now it's more empowering, because you can get comfort in it and you sort of learn how people are thinking about things. And then there's always going to be solutions, right? There's always solutions to these things, but you got to know what you're solving for and what people want, which is, part of communication. Let's hear it. right?
Right.
Wonderful. So Heidi, I really appreciate like all your thoughts and great stories, and hopefully they inspired some folks to maybe want to take some next steps and investigate for this for themselves and their families and their businesses. So anyone's wanted to reach out to you and learn more about what you do and how you help, like how would be best for them to reach you?
Right. Yeah. The best way to reach me is you can find me on my website, which is pathfinderlegacy.com. All my contact information is out there, my email address, my phone number. My phone number, you can either call me or you can text me on that number. And you can also set up my calendar is out there. So if you wanted to set up a discovery call, we can there's no charge for that. We could do a 30-minute discovery call and see if it's a good fit and what you're wanting to accomplish and see if it's something that we can help you with. So yeah, just going to pathfinderlegacy.com. And I have a lot of resources as well under the resource page that there's some different checklists and such for families to use. So if you don't know where to begin, I also have on one of my pages on my website a life and business event checklist. So that kind of is, oh, do we really need to look at our plan? We have a plan we've done 10 years ago. How do I know if I should look at it? Go out there and look at one of those lists, and there's a whole bunch of check the boxes on, okay, did this happen or did this happen? So we know if we need to evaluate our plan. So I've just got a lot of resources out there. And as well, I do have a podcast as well. So there's many episodes now. And I think I've got 40 some episodes. So feel
Nice.
free to listen to some of those. Just so many resources to offer up that, because it's a scary thing. And I don't know that if I wouldn't have been working in this industry, that I would have even thought about this and work with this as much, because I wouldn't have had the awareness that what it really means if I don't have a plan.
Right. Right. So listen, tons of resources, Heidi, that you're offering. And again, has anyone witnessed from this conversation? She's not a scary person to talk to. I know the topic can be scary or intimidating or may cause some concern, but obviously seeing Heidi and how you operate and how you really are thoughtful in what you're asking and listening to folks, I'm sure everyone would get some benefit from just having a chat. But there's plenty of resources for people to get started. So I encourage you to do so. So Heidi, thanks again for sharing so much of your wisdom and your background and history, and hopefully it's inspired folks to take some action and take advantage of some of the resources you have, as well as explore maybe what you're offering. So thanks for joining me.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me today, Tom. I've had a lot of fun in visiting about this and just making sure that we get the word out there for our listeners that they take action and make a plan.
Wonderful. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for joining me on this episode today. I really am grateful for you as listeners to the Perennial Pride podcast. I hope you're getting some tremendous value out of it and hopefully pushing you along your journey to financial freedom. I put this podcast together really to help you get more educated around your finances so that you feel empowered to live the life that you really want. And if you like the content that you heard today or watched, then I would encourage you to go to my website, perennialpride.com. There's tons of other content there. And you can access my book, Wealth Beyond the Numbers. You can buy it there on my website. It's a aggregation of a lot of great tips and tools I've learned to not only build my wealth in my accounts, but build wealth in my life and abundance and joy, and something that has a lot of my experiences in the journey that I've been on personally. Hopefully that can be also of value to you as you sort of move forward. So thanks again for being a Perennial Pride listener, and we'll see you on the next episode.